Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Then and Now History. Thanks for joining me today, where we'll be going over the second part of the Historical Empire Iceberg. So, like I said in part one, for those of you unaware, in the context of this video, an iceberg is a type of organizing chart where at the top of the iceberg is something of a more well-known category, like in the last video was the Roman Empire and the Mongol Empire, like really well-known empires. And as we go further down on the iceberg, we will get into more like unknown or more niche empires, sort of like how an iceberg gets bigger the further down it goes into the water. As with last time too, full credit for this chart goes to the Reddit user DukeofPembroke. I did not create it, I'm just using it for this video. But with all that being said, without any further ado, let's dig into Tier 2 of the Historical Empire Iceberg, starting with the Byzantine Empire. So remember in the last part when I said the Western Roman Empire fell in 476? This is what I meant. Because the Byzantine Empire was really a continuation of the Roman Empire, just with the Roman Empire's eastern territories. In fact, the word Byzantine is a title we gave them. If you were somehow able to go back in time and ask a citizen of that empire who they were and where they would say that they are a Roman in the Roman Empire. However, there were a few distinctions that were big enough to justify you seeing a difference in between the two emperors. For example, while the Western Roman Empire was typically associated with like Latin culture, like think of the Vatican, um, the Eastern Roman Empire was more influenced by the already existing Greek culture because it was in the eastern half of the Mediterranean, and ever since Alexander the Great, Greek was really the dominating culture of that part of the world. Related to this, I mentioned the Vatican as the Western Roman Empire. That's because the Western Roman Empire was more associated with the Catholic Church of Christianity, as opposed to the eastern part of the Roman Empire, which is more associated with the Orthodox Church, or as it's sometimes called, the Eastern Orthodox Church. Although these two churches didn't exist at the time of the Byzantine Empire, and that would come centuries later in 1054, but details. Keeping in line with the idea that the Byzantines were really just a continuation of the Romans, after the Western Roman Empire fell, the Byzantines wanted to reclaim its essentially lost territory. And as such, the Byzantines reached their greatest height under Emperor Justinian, who ruled essentially throughout all the 500s up until the 560s. His reign was very important, and it actually saw the Byzantines retake the city of Rome. Uh, they only held on to it for a few years and lost it almost immediately after Justinian died. But really, it's the thought that counts. And Justinian was really the high point of Byzantine expansion and really rule. I won't say it's all downhill for the Byzantines after Justinian's death, but due to a small outbreak of the Black Death, funny story, and conquests from first the Persians and then later the Muslim caliphates starting in the 600s, the Byzantines really started to experience sort of a long decline. This all led up until the 1070s AD, when the Byzantine Empire was really only modern-day Greece and Anatolia, or what we call modern-day Turkey. And it was at this time, in 1071, that the Byzantines lost Anatolia to the Seljuk Turks. And this loss of territory is what started what's now known as the First Crusade. Despite being the sole reason they exist, the Byzantines didn't really interact all that much with the Catholic Crusades, until, that is, the Fourth. When talking about the Fourth Crusade, it is very important to remember the distinct religious differences between the Eastern Byzantines and the Western Catholics. This is because, in 1204, on their way to the Holy Land, the Catholic Crusaders wanted to stop for a little rest in Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. However, while in Constantinople, the Crusaders were hired by a Byzantine prince to deal with the Byzantine emperor so that the Byzantine prince could become emperor. This happens, but the new emperor doesn't pay the Crusaders. This was not good. Angry at not being paid, the Catholic Crusaders then gave in to centuries of religious hatred and sacked Constantinople, turning on their fellow Christians. The sack of Constantinople is so important to Byzantine history precisely because of how catastrophic it was. Entire sections of the city were burned, and countless priceless artifacts were taken back to Western Europe by the Crusaders, not to mention thousands of Christians massacred their fellow Christians. In the wake of this destruction, the territory of the Byzantine Empire was carved up into multiple Crusader states, sort of like what happened in the Middle East with the other Crusades, with the one distinction here being, of course, that those Crusader states were already filled with Christians. They were just Orthodox Christians and not Catholic. A few remnants of Byzantine territory under Byzantine rule did manage to escape the Fourth Crusade's wrath, however, and over the next century after the Fourth Crusade, the Byzantine Empire would eventually recover most of its territory pre-Crusade, but it's generally agreed that the Fourth Crusade and the sack of Constantinople, at this point, there was really no turning back for the decline of the Byzantines. And starting in the early 1300s and continuing throughout the next century and a half, the Byzantines would start losing more and more of their territory to the newly rising Ottoman Sultanate from Anatolia. This all culminated in 1453 when, after having surrounded and blockaded the city, the Ottomans broke the walls of Constantinople and rushed in, conquering once and for all the Roman Empire. Next up is a place a lot of people know of, but probably for the wrong reasons, Sparta. So if you want to get really technical about it, which of course I always do, Sparta was actually only the name of the main settlement of the territory that we identify as Sparta. That territory was known as Lacedaemon. The Sparta everyone thinks of, shirtless hunks, kicking pits, this is what have you, even though none of that's accurate, that was around the 400s BC with King Leonidas and the Persian invasions. Fun fact that I didn't know where else to put in this video, but Sparta, very rarely in world history, was actually a dual monarchy. Not in the sense like one king ruled two kingdoms. No, two kings ruled one kingdom. Like King Leonidas, he had a completely other king that ruled with him, like from a different family. No one, like, he had a name. I can't remember it right now because everyone always remembers Leonidas. But like, how often does that happen in history? Like two kings ruling one place. It's so weird. Okay, but back on track. The Persian Wars were from the 490s to the 450s BC. Persia wanted to conquer Greece. The Greek city-states wanted them to not conquer Greece, so they all banded together under largely Athens and Sparta, and eventually, surprisingly, they were able to actually repel the Persian invasions. So after Persia is repelled and the Death Star explodes, there's peace in the land for all of eternity. Wait, no, 10 years. That's because after the defeat of Persia, Athens and Sparta pulled a contemporary US and China, and the two of them got stronger and stronger until, inevitably, there had to be a war between the two of them. This is known as the Peloponnesian Wars, which lasted 30 years, but eventually did see a Sparta victory. After Sparta won the Peloponnesian War, it was really the dominant city-state in ancient Greece, and using its power, it went on to exert its influence all over ancient Greece, but also onto the western coast of Anatolia. This period was known as the Spartan hegemony, and it was a good time for Sparta and absolutely no one else. Actually, I take that back. It wasn't even a good time for all Spartans. That's because Sparta was really divided into two categories of people within it. I mean, there were more categories, but simplifying it's two. There were free Spartans, and then there were helots, or slaves as we would call them. And during this time, there were multiple helot revolts in Sparta. They were all put down, but it was a sign of things to come. Tired of Sparta being 100% of a dick 100% of the time, an alliance of Greek city-states, including Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and also notably Persia, allied together to beat back Sparta, which they did, ending the Spartan hegemony. After this defeat and increasing revolts from the Helots, the city-state of Sparta was in a very weakened state, and it continued this way until 331, when Alexander the Great forced Sparta to join the League of Corinth, or essentially a unified Greece under Alexander's rule. Alright, next up on the iceberg is the Ottoman Empire. Why didn't you talk about the Ottomans right after you talked about the Byzantines? Why don't you shut the fuck up? So the Ottoman Empire is generally agreed to have begun around the late 13th century, and it was founded by Osman I, even though he wasn't an emperor. And the century after Osman's death, the Ottomans would expand out of their western Anatolian foothold, conquering almost all Byzantine territories by 1453. The Ottomans encountered a slight speed bump to this idea of global domination, though, in the early 1400s, when an external invasion by an empire called the Timurids led to notably the only civil war in all of the Ottomans' history. Now, civil wars aren't typically good for external expansion, but fast forward a brisk 10 years and the Ottomans had all their old territory back, but they weren't satisfied. They were looking for some more. This, of course, brings us to the historian bingo year of 1453, when Sultan Mehmed II pretty definitively ended any excuse nerds like me have for saying Rome never fell. The next century and a bit after the fall of Constantinople would be one of pretty near constant Ottoman expansion, this culminating with Suleiman the Magnificent, who, on top of loving himself a good hat, ruled for a whopping 46 years. And boy oh boy did he make those years count. Under Suleiman, the Ottomans expanded to pretty much all of North Africa, pretty much all of Eastern Europe up until Budapest, and down south till Baghdad, so spanning a good portion of 3 continents. Suleiman died in 1566, and 5 years later the Ottomans found themselves in war with Venice. Now, Venice on its own, don't make me laugh, but the Ottomans weren't just fighting Venice, because in this war they were fighting essentially all of Italy in the form of its various states, and also, probably more importantly, the Spanish Empire, with Spain. So the alliance between Spain and the Italian states created what's known as the Holy Alliance, and the Holy Alliance engaged the Ottoman fleet at what's called the Battle of Lepanto, again in 1571. Now, Lepanto is very important because the Ottomans lost. It wasn't that catastrophic of a loss, and they built a lot of their ships back almost immediately, but it signified for the first time really ever since the Ottomans started expanding that they could be beaten. After Lepanto and for the broader 17th century, it used to be common to describe this period of Ottoman history as a long decline, whereas in recent history that's kind of fallen out of favor for more saying that the Ottomans were kind of just chilling for the 17th century. Think of it kind of like this. If there's this giant bully on the block and a new stronger bully comes along and like puts him in his place, well, that doesn't really change anything. I mean, you're still not going to go and ask Buford for his lunch money, are you? Yeah, the Ottomans were beaten once, and they weren't really expanding as much, but they were still plenty scary on their own. But then again, with the latter half of the 18th and then all of the 19th century, yeah, the Ottomans were definitely starting to decline. Now, there's a lot of reasons for this, but probably a big one is that because the Ottomans were already and for so long hostile to the vast majority of Europe, they weren't in nearly as good of a position to capitalize on the Industrial Revolution as countries in Western Europe like France or the UK were. Because of this, the Ottomans started to fall behind. Not just behind Europe, though, notably, as in the 1830s and 1840s, they got into two scuffles with their own puppet state of Egypt. And then 1853 to 56 saw the Crimean War, where in one corner, Russia, and in another corner, the Ottomans, backed by France, the UK, and what would become Italy. Now, the Western European powers didn't do this out of the kindness of their own hearts. They just didn't want Russia to come down on an already weakened Ottomans and just go nuts. So the Crimean War was technically a victory for the Ottomans, but it's kind of a victory in the sense of freeing your leg from a bear trap by cutting it off. Yeah, you got it out, but it hurts like hell, and oh yeah, you're bleeding out. In this case, bleeding out for the Ottomans meant taking on a lot of debt. Then the Ottomans, never catching a break in the 1800s, in the 1870s saw their Eastern European provinces like Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, Montenegro, oh my god, they all broke away in independence. And by the turn of the 1900s, the Ottoman Empire was really just modern-day Turkey and Syria. An internal revolution in 1908 greatly weakened the Ottoman government, and then, 10 years later, World War I came around to shoot it dead. The original treaty that saw the Ottomans leave World War I took their territory and essentially turned it into one giant checkerboard. Now, unsurprisingly, the Turks living in that territory didn't really like this that much, and from 1920 to 1923 was what's called the Turkish War of Independence, which ended when the Turks living there pushed out the forces of Great Britain and France, who were really enforcing these new boundaries. They pushed them out, and in 1923, the Ottoman Empire was officially dissolved, and in its place was the Republic of Turkey. Oh, what? That's what it's called. They changed the name. Next up is everyone's favorite example of why you should never create a multi-ethnic state in the Balkans, Yugoslavia. Like Turkey, I've decided I like the ring of that, Yugoslavia also rose out of the ashes from World War I. So by the end of 1918, Serbia was in a pretty good position, being on the side of the victorious powers of World War I. Likewise, Austria-Hungary, being on the not victorious powers, was in a pretty not good position. So, at the end of 1918, Serbia merged with a bunch of South Slavs from the Austro-Hungarian Empire and created the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes. Realizing that ultimately no one's going to care enough to say all that, however, the kingdom's leaders changed the name to the much more easier to say Kingdom of Yugoslavia in 1929. Then, a few years later, Adolf Hitler was jealous of the kingdom's new name, and because of that, and a few other reasons, Nazi Germany invaded Yugoslavia in 1941, and from this, really two main groups of resistance to Nazi occupation formed. There were the partisans, who were communist, and people who are called the Chetniks, or everyone else. The partisans, with their effective wartime strategy and their habit of not genociding their own people, grew over to win more and more support from the Yugoslav people, and in 1945 they were even recognized as the legitimate government of Yugoslavia by the Allied powers. After World War II ended, but still in 1945, official elections were held to determine the actual government of Yugoslavia. In these elections, the Communists won an overwhelming victory, probably because their opposition boycotted the vote. The always surefire way of winning elections. Like, that never made sense to me. So Yugoslavia officially had a brand new socialist government led by a man called Josip Broz Tito. And Tito, he was actually the prominent leader of the partisans during World War II. He was a very central military figure and political leader. He was very popular in Yugoslavia. And one of the first things that this new socialist Yugoslavia does is they depose the old monarchy. So, funny fact, you want to know where King Peter II of Yugoslavia retired and spent the rest of his days? Sunny Denver, Colorado, baby! Under Tito, Yugoslavia officially changed its name to the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia, and more substantially, they actually spent the Cold War doing pretty alright for themselves. Because the interesting thing is, despite being a socialist government, Yugoslavia and Tito actually distanced themselves from the Soviet Union, and Tito went so far as to declare Yugoslavia a neutral nation in the Cold War. Unfortunately for Yugoslavia, though, you know that old saying, don't put your eggs in one basket? Well, they did, except they put all their Titos in one basket, and then that basket got gangrene. Well, Tito got gangrene, and I'm losing track of this. Tito died in 1980. And with his death, the already existing but dormant tensions between the various Slavs and ethnicities within Yugoslavia, they began to get much worse. So, starting in the late 80s and going through the early 90s, a Serbian politician named Slobodan Milosevic wanted to beef up Serbia's position within Yugoslavia. And eventually Milosevic was able to start making good on this because he was able to get the loyal votes of the other republics within Yugoslavia, Kosovo, Vojvodina, Montenegro, and Serbia itself. So that was 4 out of the 8 republic nation. So that he had a majority to do essentially whatever he wanted. Milosevic's strongmanning naturally made the non-Serbian republics or non-loyal Serbian republics in Yugoslavia nervous. These included Bosnia, Croatia, Slovenia, and Macedonia. Naturally, this led to a sort of constitutional crisis in Yugoslavia, and so in January of 1990, all 8 republics met. And at this convention of the republics, Croatia and Slovenia, they put forward methods to make Yugoslavia more democratic or more responsible to its individual republics, as opposed to Serbia says everything that happens. Milosevic, however, wasn't having this. Croatia and Slovenia then weren't having Milosevic, and their delegations left the conference. After this, Milosevic tried to continue like everything was normal, and then every other delegation not loyal to Milosevic also left, and the Yugoslav Communist Party was officially dissolved. Now, what happened soon after this was the Yugoslav Wars. And the Yugoslav Wars are very important, but they're also very complex and very complicated and deserve a video on their own explaining them. A general theme of the wars is that individual republics, or not loyal to Serbia, would try and replace federal Yugoslav troops with their own members, with their own soldiers from their republic. Essentially, think of a state in the U.S. kicking out like the army, like the army troops from an army base, and instead putting its own state guard on there, which hasn't happened yet. Anyway, inevitably, this process saw Republic troops and federal troops of Yugoslavia clash, and this is what began the Yugoslav Wars. And it's in this way that saw Yugoslavia break up violently in most cases. This is how Bosnia and Herzegovina, Slovenia, Croatia, yeah, those three republics, that's how they got their independence. And Kosovo, an independent or an autonomous republic within Serbia, fought, but it never got there. It never got its independence. At least according to the UN. It's complicated. Interestingly enough, Macedonia, one of the republics in Yugoslavia, while all of this fighting was going on, they just passed a referendum and left. No violence, just like that. Really puts things into perspective, doesn't it? Now, I did mention that the Yugoslav wars were complicated and complex, but I would be failing my duty as a YouTube historian if I didn't say that the most prominent thing from the Yugoslav wars was genocide, committed on both sides. And the biggest takeaway from the Yugoslav wars is that, in all, they were horrific, and that is the biggest thing not to forget. The Yugoslav wars lasted from 1991 to 2001, and in 2003, Yugoslavia officially ended and became known as the union between Serbia and Montenegro, because those were the only republics still left. And then in 2006, Montenegro left. The Holy Roman Empire was created in the year 800 when Charlemagne, aka Carolus Magnus, aka Charles the Great, aka Chuck the Rad, was crowned Holy Roman Emperor by Pope Leo III. Fun fact, that's why it's called the Holy Roman Empire. Now, crowning a Frankish ruler of the Frankish Empire as the Roman Emperor had the unfortunate, but maybe intended, probably intended, side effect of pissing off the very much still alive Byzantines, or the Romans, over in the Byzantine Empire. But Charlemagne was like god of Europe at this point, so nothing really came of it. Now, the title of Holy Roman Emperor and Holy Roman Empire would fall out of use for a few decades in the early 900s, up until German ruler Otto I in 962 styles himself as the heir to Charlemagne and proclaims himself, or once again is proclaimed, the Holy Roman Emperor. I always keep doing that. The Holy Roman Empire reached its largest territorial extent in the 13th century, and when times were good, they were good. But when times were bad, they were bad. Because the Holy Roman Empire depended on the relationship between the emperor and the lords that served under him, or what are known as vassals. Now, in medieval and feudal Europe, vassals tended to have a fair deal of power that they could use on their own, so long as they didn't go directly against the person above them. And most kingdoms operated fairly well under this system. The difference with the Holy Roman Empire is the amount of vassals they had. Because while most kingdoms had, like, a few, like tens, dozens, the HRE, yeah, they had 1,800. 1,800. So, because of this, if enough vassals got pissed off at the emperor was kind of their bitch. This vassal emperor enemies lovers dynamic was best summarized in what's called the investiture controversy. So, really oversimplifying and skimming over it, the investiture controversy is when a Holy Roman Emperor in 1054, I believe, did something to piss off the Pope, and the Pope very much was pissed off, and so he ordered he excommunicated the Holy Roman Emperor. And so what that meant is that the Holy Roman Emperor's vassals had no right to follow him, or in fact, they had a right not to follow him. And so this created a lot of rebellions in the Holy Roman Empire, and the emperor was really overwhelmed to a point where he had to go to the Pope. And the story says he was on his knees for 3 days outside of the Pope's castle, begging for forgiveness because of how screwed he was from his vassals. Probably the biggest single power individual vassals had over the empire, besides the occasional raising troops, going to war power, was that the Holy Roman Emperor, the position of emperor, wasn't technically inherited. It was actually elected by a group of 7 princes of the empire that were collectively known as the Electoral College. And the Electoral College would get together, and when an emperor died, they would elect a new emperor. Now, technically, it's not inherited, but as time went on, yeah, the electors were bought, and so families would see their descendants in line for the emperor, like for centuries, because the electors were bought. And those elector positions, while the emperor wasn't inherited, those electors, they were inherited. So they were very nice to have. Eventually, in the 1400s, a family would come to the imperial throne, and that family was known as the Habsburgs. Now, the Habsburgs are very important for a lot of reasons throughout all of Europe, not just the HRE, but they're also important in the HRE because they were the last family to hold the position of emperor. Now, granted, they held it for like 400 years, but still they were the last, so you know. Now, the Holy Roman Empire, being located smack dab in the middle of Europe, was kind of unsurprisingly smack dab in the middle of a lot of European history. For instance, the Holy Roman Empire was the starting grounds for the Protestant Reformation. It was the starting ground and main battleground for the 30 Years' War, and a bunch of other things. However, it's after the 30 Years' War, from 1648 pretty much onwards, that the Holy Roman Empire really becomes just Austria, which was what the Habsburgs ruled on top of being the emperor. And that's because the 30 Years' War, the 30 Years' War ended, and a big part of its peace treaty saw individual vassals within the Holy Roman Empire get significantly more freedom, like on top of the freedom that they already had. So essentially, the Holy Roman Emperor's vassals were vassals only for like ceremonial purposes, and they had significant power. And really, it was only Habsburg Austria that was exerting influence on behalf of the empire at this point. The HRE's old Twilight Grandpappy days would be defined between the relationship between Habsburg Austria and another kingdom to its north, Prussia, which was ruled by the family Hohenzollern. and the relationship between those two, uh, it would sometimes be nice, admittedly. However, a lot more times it would be defined by war between the two powers, and a lot of times those wars would end up dragging in through a series of alliances other European powers. This is how we got, for instance, the First Silesian War, the Second Silesian War, the 7 Years' War, if you ask me, the First World War, and a few others. Hi, quick editor's note. There's literally a war called the War of Austrian Succession that happened in large part because of Prussia and, well, Austria, but you knew that. So it was a pretty big deal. Alas, following the universally consistent rule of gravity, everything that rises must fall, and the Holy Roman Empire's fall, like so many others, came from Napoleon. In 1806, the Austrian/Holy Roman Empire was defeated by Napoleon's forces at the Battle of Austerlitz, and it's after Austerlitz that Emperor Francis the Second, I think, of the Holy Roman Emperor, but Francis the First, definitely, of Austria, dissolves the title of Holy Roman Empire and he abdicates his throne. The reason he did this, and I'm quoting him directly here, is like hell, I'm going to let that 5 foot Frenchie take my crown. Well, pretty straightforward. And thus ended the over 1,000-year history of the Holy Roman Empire. Hi, so it's Then and Now History Guy here. And so I thought I was doing a pretty good job with this video. I thought I was doing pretty good, concise explanations of each empire, sticking on track. Um, that was until I realized I still have 4 more empires to get through. And it took 30 minutes to do 5. So this part 2 is gonna get a part 2. My bad. But it's all for the best, hopefully, ultimately. I just knocked on wood. Because in between now and then, I'm going to put in a few more empires into what would be the second half of Tier 2 to make sure that Part 2 is a full-length video that you lovely people deserve. So that should come out definitely in the future. Um, but yeah, until then, that's part 1 of Tier 2 of the Historical Empire Iceberg, and I really hope you guys enjoyed. I had a lot of fun recording, and I had a lot of fun researching, and I can't wait for part 2 of part 2. So, anyways, thank you all for watching. Thank you so much, and I hope to see you in the next video. Bye.